All right, well, hey there, AP Europeans. The purpose of this video is so we can take a look at 16th century society and politics. It says it right there. What this really is doing is kind of taking some of the, I guess, the magisterial Reformation and some of the religious Reformation and everything that's going on there, those challenges to the great chain of being, and kind of putting it into context of how it's going to impact more and more people. So, well, let's check this out. So when we're talking about 16th century society, there's still a big carryover from what we've seen with the Great Chain, going back to the medieval period. So in this line where it says established hierarchies are still defining social status and perceptions, the Great Chain of Being is still kind of a thing. It's not like anything, it's not a thing where people are saying, I believe in the Great Chain of Being, but they kind of believe that once you're born into a certain class of society, for the most part, you're going to be there. And so not everybody is open in rebellion like Luther or like the German peasants are there for a couple of years. These established systems of kind of keeping control, it's still very much a normal thing in Europe. And these are there whether you're talking about gender, class, or religion. For religion, regardless of what denomination you are adhering to, there's a certain level of structure that the church applies, not just to the church congregation, but to society in general. For gender, there is still a male driven uh, paternal hierarchy, a patriarchy within the household where the ability for women to kind of express themselves is very limited. And in the class hierarchy, that's like the kings and the nobles, and then the lower nobles, and then the peasants, and things that have been around for a long time. So you want to make sure that you're not assuming that everybody is rebelling, although the way we talk about it, it seems like it's slowly moving in that direction. There's also a difference in how this is set up between rural and urban settings. I don't like the word rural, but that's like folks in the countryside. That's our peasant farmers in these little villages. Urban settings, that's like cities, but don't think cities like today. Cities then, if you had like 10,000 people in it, that was like a major population center. But things are run differently depending on if you're in the city with 10,000 people or if you are in the countryside, maybe with only a few dozen people or maybe a couple of hundred people at top. One thing that's kind of consistent throughout is sort of the leisure activities that people engage in. It's like when you think about what people do for fun now, it's always kind of like it's very like family structured or like one or two people kind of interacting and just having like going out to see a movie or going out to dinner. It's kind of like that. But in this time period, communal activities are very leisure activities are very communal in nature, like the whole village participating in this. So the picture here, these are children playing games, but this is kind of a normal like festival day scene where the whole community kind of turns out and everybody's just having like a good wholesome family time. And you can kind of like zoom in a little bit and there's boys and girls and in some cases men and women that are just kind of goofing around having a good time. These festivals that are here, they are all organized around church calendar, the days for different saints. These are really kind of a centerpiece of the community nature of the Catholic Church, and some of that carries over into the Lutheran beliefs, not so much in the Calvinist beliefs, but we can maybe start to see how changes in church are going to have an impact in changes in society. And then festivals like Carnival or Mardi Gras, which are religiously the origin of this is religious because Fat Tuesday for Mardi Gras is before Ash Wednesday, which begins the period of Lent or sacrifice for Christians. So this is really kind of what the calendar is based around. But these community-based leisure activities is also based around the agricultural cycle, like harvest feasts. Like in the fall, whether it is in like the early fall or the later fall, excuse me, there is an element of Thanksgiving Day feasts as a way to celebrate with your entire community, well, the successful conclusion the to the harvest season. So on this kind of broad scale community based way of doing things. Everything on this, it kind of has this, some consistent carry through going through this period, but as we'll see here in a second, there's definitely some changes that are going to be felt by, well, more and more Europeans. Social tensions and social changes are going to happen because there's a dislocation that's going on in society. We saw a little of this back in Unit 1, where we were seeing that people were moving more and more to towns, especially in England, because the landowners were enclosing the village lands and kind of forcing people to move. But then there's also like the shifting authority of the church. If the church was really in charge, which it was, of maintaining like moral behavior in villages and in communities, well, when some communities kind of like turn away from the Catholic Church, well, then there's gets to be questions about like, well, who's really going to be in charge of governing this moral behavior? In a lot of cases, just turns to city governments, where they are trying to get some kind of control, where you're talking about more people moving in, and more people moving in that might have some different, well, moral values. And so in some cities, you kind of see some abolition or the restriction of carnival celebrations. Because one thing about like Mardi Gras before you get to the period of Lent, if Lent is sacrifice, Carnival or Mardi Gras, it is like the last party before you go into this, period of sacrifice for yourself. And so this is like causing some legal issues. And so some cities just choose to get rid of all that altogether, especially like Calvinist cities are on this, like Geneva in Switzerland, which is kind of where John Calvin was, writing a lot of his work. They abolished this kind of community activity because they see this kind of causing, well, immoral criminal activity. And then when you talk about like the city authorities and the church authorities, well, they kind of combine efforts for a while to try to enforce communal norms to make sure that everything is being like, kind of consistently applied and trying to keep moral behavior together. But they're doing this through like rituals of public humiliation, like what we think about like modern police and going into like the city jail for committing a petty crime. That's not really what's going on here. So public humiliation, we're talking about putting people in the stocks, which are like these wooden blocks where you kind of put your head and your hands through and they kind of hold you in place. Charivari is where they tie your hands and they kind of parade you through town on a donkey or on a mule or sometime on an ox, and people are like throwing rotten food at you. This idea of like public humiliation is really a strong thing. And, if you are accused of having an affair outside of your marriage, this is kind of what is waiting for you on this. I'm not even talking like violent crime. We're talking about like what they consider to be moral crimes, like cheating on your spouse or stealing, even like petty theft, like stealing food for your family. There's a level of like community enforcement, kind of these days what we kind of refer to as a little bit of vigilante justice. It's a little bit of a normal thing in this time period, which is one thing that makes us very different from where we are in modern Europe. This is kind of a carryover of, well, the Middle Ages. All right, so far in what we've been looking at on this, we are looking at those established hierarchies as they exist on class and religion, and how there are some challenges that have gone on with those. Whether it is a challenge on religion, like Luther and Calvin, kind of making the idea that those challenges are okay, or if you kind of expand this out, you can talk about the challenges of class, not religion, but class, when it comes down to things like the German peasant revolts, or like the nobility that are challenging the authority of a king or of the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is a big element of what's happening throughout the 16th century and the 1500s, right? But there is one other aspect of these type of, well, this type of challenge and this type of argument against some of the structured hierarchies, and it's got to do with gender roles, especially as they kind of relates into the family. So when it in the family unit, families are more than just like your family and your social structure, but it really is just kind of like an economic structure that's based on society. Whether you're talking about a rural household, like out in the country, or an urban household, most people in the household, like husband, wife, children. Most of them, in fact, are, well, all involved in like an economic production, like peasant farmers. Everybody's working on the farm. Everybody's got chores to do. They're not really getting paid for it, so to speak, but it's part of that subsistence lifestyle livelihood that's going on. For folks that are in the city, this is more along the lines of, like, think about like a blacksmith shop or a carpenter shop or a printer shop for that matter. When you're looking at this, you've got, for the most part, men are involved in the skilled craftsmen with this, because that is just the gender split that's going on here. But women are engaged in a separate task, but it's a task that complements the overall goal. If it's a family business, well, maybe the husband is conducting doing the manual labor, and the wife is going to be more involved with the bookkeeping or in the sort of arranging and of making sure you have the right supplies at the right time. It's kind of like a family business, like all these businesses are family business. So this is where, like in a family basis, there's a general steadiness that goes on with this, really for like another couple of centuries, to tell you the truth. But where things come into play is like in the Renaissance and even through the Reformation, there is just an ongoing debate about the debate over women's roles. And I know this just all kind of showed up all at once, and we can talk our way through it. Back in, I think in chapter 12, there was a little section where it talked about querelle de femme, it's French for the debates about women, or the quarrels over women. In the Renaissance, one of the things that came up was the idea of, women's female education. Should women go to school in the same way that Renaissance men went to school? Because Renaissance men needed to know how to be worldly people, and for the most part, women weren't really involved with that very much. That it was pretty rare for a woman to go through humanist training or to become a skilled artisan, craftsman, artist during the Renaissance. Did you notice that when you're looking at Renaissance art, almost everybody was, I mean, everybody that we saw, it was male artists. There were some female artists, but it's pretty rare exception. For the most part, when you're talking about the role that women have either in the family or in the church or in society at large, the role is really considered to be like the wife and mother, but there's really not much of a public role that's allowed. Uh, 15th century, 16th century Europe, it's like women are supposed to be kind of like the moral caretakers of what's going on in the house. Anything outside the house is not okay. And if women aren't able to kind of provide that moral sort of guidance to the family, well, this is a challenge just for the rest of society. You may have noticed that when Henry VIII, when his wife Anne Boleyn was accused of having an affair, I mean, she lost her life over this, but the man that she was having an affair with, there's like similar levels of concern and of like the instability that could create, but it's not the same level of punishment that comes into play. Women are either seen as being in a role of being a moral caregiver or really like as a threat to society. And for women's roles in the church, women can't be in the priesthood, but in the Catholic Church, the priests can't marry. It's one of the things that the Lutheran Church and the Calvinist Church really changed about women's roles, was the fact that priests could, well, have a wife. Like ministers can have a wife and a family, because that doesn't mean that they can't be caretakers for people's spiritual well-being. Beyond this, on the opposite end of this, you have these ongoing accusations that seem to come up during this time period over women being witches, not riches, witches with a W. This is kind of at its peak between 1580 and 1650. So this is hitting its peak at about the same time that we're seeing French wars of religion and the 30 Years' War, and there's all of this social economic upheaval. There's all these accusations about, if you're not my exact kind of Christianity, you are doing the work of the devil. Sometimes when it comes down to it, anybody that is seen as being a challenge to the normal hierarchy of things, they are seen as doing the work of the devil. So if there are women that are kind of outspoken in the idea that they can have a voice in protecting somebody's spiritual well-being, accusations of witchcraft go along with this. And this is a generational like input that comes in that kind of like reflects the same time period as the wars of religion. So maybe this is just a different angle of a different war of religion. Not that they're really witches, because I don't think witchcraft is a real thing where they're doing magic. Sorry if you don't agree with me there. But this is just, it's more about the accusation and the controlling aspect of things, not like kings trying to control nobles, but in some cases, the men in the community trying to control the women in the community. So to sum up here, and this is going like 15 minutes on into this. So the quick summary here is when you're looking at the society and political changes, it kind of reflects some of the challenges to the structures that we see in politics and religion and other topics in this unit. We're just kind of extending it to, well, like local law enforcement, who's going to be in charge of moral regulation, and even down into like family structures and the role of women in the community. There's a lot of change that's on the way, and change is scary. And this just stands an example of how people are resistant to that level of change. Thanks for listening.